So welcome to our third seminar in our series on climate and justice in cities. This is our Knowledge Cafe, where we invite faculty, postdoctoral researchers, and advanced PhD students to talk about their research, and we encourage this to be an informal setting. So we're hoping to get some questions and comments from the audience, and we're open to having that kind of discussion. So this is a lunch, we call it kind of a brown bag seminar. Laura, did you want to kick off with the land acknowledgement?
Happy to do that. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'd like to acknowledge the land that the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Seneca, and the Haudenosaunee. We are grateful to operate and work on this land, and we acknowledge our privilege in doing that. Thank you so much.
Great. So welcome all to the School of Cities. We're delighted to be welcoming Joanna Kocsis to our speaker series. Joanna is an anti-oppressive participatory research method specialist and PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Her research has inquired into the international development project from many angles, ranging from the learning processes of international development grant makers to the role of psychological empowerment in the innovative behavior of subsistence farmers in Central America. Most recently, she's been exploring the role of affect in the lived experiences of marginalized youth in Havana, Cuba. Generally, her work focuses on making visible and undoing systems that colonize and restrict the production of knowledge by communities that face oppression. And she uses transformative participatory research to do this. Joanna has held positions at the International Development Research Center, has served as the Learning and Evaluation Specialist for Urban Climate Resilience in the Southeast Asia Partnership since 2014. She's co-chaired the EDI working group of the Canadian Evaluation Society since 2018, and she served as the Green Party of Canada candidate for Niagara West in the 44th federal election in 2021. And so if we have extra time, we could talk about that experience too at the end. So this presentation will connect theoretical developments around rights and resilience in the field of urban climate justice and to practice by grounding the literature's key arguments in the experiences of a 5-year project based in Southeast Asian cities. So with that, thank you, Joanna, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thank you for having me. It's really great to be here. I'm also on campus right now, but I live in Niagara, which is the territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people that they were made to relinquish as treaty territory through many years of colonial imposition. So I am today on campus and coming to you from campus. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. I feel like after all this time, there's no elegant way. They haven't developed an elegant way of just clicking and having your screen shared. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ravisha. So today I'm going to talk to you about a project that I worked on and continue to work on called the Urban Climate Resilience in Southeast Asia project. So the project involved a lot of people, not just me, and I'm just sort of here on behalf of the team to tell you a little bit about it. Before I start and give anything away, I would love for people, and I don't think there are that many of us, so you can either turn on your mic or drop something into the chat. What are some of the urban climate impacts that come to mind when you think of urban climate resilience? In what ways does the climate impact urban centers? So feel free to just unmute, or, sorry, I'm trying to move my little screen here, or drop something into the chat, and let's see what we can come up with. So Baldwin says heat. Yeah, sorry, did someone unmute there? Go ahead.
I was going to ask whether the weird weather patterns are also a part of that. Yeah, we have drought.
Yeah, weird weather patterns. So flooding, the drought flooding, sort of going back and forth. And Bogdan says the forced climate migration for urban areas close to water experience. Okay, that's not where I thought you were going. So that's interesting. Close to water experiencing rising water levels. So people, as the water level rises, are getting pushed out of sort of marginalized, not great territory and having to migrate into cities. Extremely polarized weather, what we call extreme weather events. So things that would normally happen once every 50 years that might be happening once every 5 to 10 years now. So there's increasing frequency of bad weather, extreme weather. And then there's the everyday, like Bogdan says, if water levels are rising, you just can't stay where you are. Climate migration can also take other forms, right? Migrating from places where climate is limiting your livelihoods and forcing you off of the land, for example, into urban centers. Yeah, food security, Karen brings up drought and things that impact food security, which is a really great point because we often think of climate impacts that impact the urban only as things that physically and geographically happen in urban centers, but that's not accurate, right? What goes into the urban comes from well outside the urban. Landslides, definitely, and tourism patterns for sure, especially tourism that relies on outdoor things, agriculture, natural features. So this is great because we're going to touch on I think pretty much all of this in this chat. So you can continue to drop things in the chat, and I encourage you at any time, if there's a question or if there's something that I'm saying that doesn't make sense, just unmute and shout out. Food security, yeah, just-in-time delivery is a big problem. Loss of wildlife, definitely. Loss of natural environment. So as we can see, what goes into climate impacts in the urban is quite complex. And so I want to talk just for a second about this big question. The first big question is, what does it mean when we say urban? That's a big term, and we need to kind of unpack it because the urban is often represented with sleek, tidy images like this one. This is Bangkok. But that's far from the full picture. Everyone who's been to Bangkok knows that this is not what Bangkok looks, sounds, and smells like, right? So let's look more closely. If we're concerned with governing the urban, what are we going to be making decisions about? So we'll be thinking about creating space. And does that mean that we're preserving the old? And not all these photos are from Bangkok, I'll just say. Are we preserving the old? Are we promoting the new? We'll also be thinking about moving around. Are we moving around like this? Or are we concerned with people moving around like this? Are we prioritizing machines? Are we encouraging people? Are we thinking about the well-being of people like this and their livelihoods, or the well-being of people like this and their livelihoods? Are we worried about these sorts of concerns? Are we thinking about labor and trade like this? This is a special economic zone in Cambodia and Phnom Penh. We know that the stakes and interests here are international in nature. Or are we thinking about the economy like this in a very local, very informal way? So the urban is much more complex than sort of sleek lines and big buildings. And it's a really complex system with diverse and often competing and contrasting needs and interests and radically varying levels of agency and power. And that's important. And so how does climate change impact this complex picture? Well, essentially by complicating it further. The thing about climate change is the only thing that we know about climate change for certain is that it brings increased uncertainty. That's fantastic. The impacts of climate change on urban centers can look like this one month and then this the next. It can affect infrastructure. It can affect human health. It can affect housing and buildings in urban centers. And even when the impacts of climate change don't occur physically or geographically in the urban center, it can still have a big impact on the livelihoods or the well-being or the survival of people in the urban center. So often we think of through food systems, but now we've noticed how the supply chain is quite vulnerable and quite extensive, and how there are all sorts of products that we basically rely on for survival that don't originate in the urban center and aren't really in the control of the urban governance domain. So I'm the evaluation and learning specialist for the UCRC partnership, which was a collaborative and international project that sought to address this sort of wicked problem through a multi-method approach that was bringing together researchers, policymakers, practitioners, community members to foster new dialogue, to create new knowledge, and to build new skills to improve the resilience of urban societies to the impacts of climate change. So the UCRC partnership used several different practices to try and affect change. We were trying to affect change in knowledge, in skills, in political will, and in access between community stakeholders and policymakers. The project connected a quite diverse range of stakeholders to build a network of actors that were committed to urban climate resilience. We promoted the development of innovative research tools and methodologies that were designed to more appropriately and effectively address this very complex issue. We supported a wide range of research projects, so it wasn't one question, one project, and we all worked on it. We funded a wide range of researchers, doctoral researchers, master's researchers, even sometimes undergraduate programs, as well as tenured professors, people who worked in international organizations, so that we could really investigate the breadth of issues that could fall under this umbrella of urban climate resilience. We created spaces for public dialogues on urban climate resilience, which often led to fruitful exchanges between people with very, very divergent perspectives. That was always my favorite part. And we developed a conceptual framework on urban climate resilience, and we promoted its use by other stakeholders in the field to try and provide sort of a common, this is where we were working out the framework, to try and promote sort of a common vocabulary and framework for understanding these often diverse issues. And we worked very hard to build a new generation of sort of thought leaders in the field in Southeast Asia, so that between the new generation of academics and newly emerging policymakers, people would be more capable of confronting the complexities of urban climate resilience. So, what is resilience anyway? Resilience is traditionally defined as a system's ability to absorb shocks and adjust to change in order to maintain its main functions despite hazards or perturbations, right? So it's about when you get smacked by a flood, how quickly can you go back to the status quo and go back to an equilibrium? In the context of urban planning, where we see cities as complex systems, and climate change as intersecting with those systems through multiple different sectors and subsystems, it's kind of difficult to limit ourselves to this conventional approach to resilience. Mainstream resilience approaches emphasize technical solutions to what they consider technical problems. And they shy away from questioning the role of power and daily practices that regularly exclude certain groups or make some groups more vulnerable and less resilient than others. And so the approach that we took in this project was one of transformative resilience, which is a bit different than resilience in that it sees vulnerability and resilience as something that is rooted in the lack of urban dwellers' rights and the lack of their access to the basic resources that they need. And they see that that lack is shaped by institutional failures or political and economic processes that, in fact, are driving urbanization. So thinking about the process of urbanization, not just as a physical process, but as a political process that creates specific vulnerabilities and limits people's resilience. The reason that's important to the way we were working was because if we focused on the traditional version of resilience thinking, we would be stuck in the same sort of loop as many researchers have been, which is to be focusing on how infrastructure changes, housing changes, zoning changes, and land use changes can improve people's resilience and maybe reduce their vulnerability. Instead, we wanted to ask questions about what were the daily risks that people were facing and how were those daily risks created by their marginality or their exclusion. I'm just going to take a second and check the chat here. Okay, so we've got a few more things people have dropped in. Infrastructure failure. Yes, urban includes all the spaces and systems that support urban populations, Baldwin. Yeah, from the suburban to the peri-urban to rural to global, exactly. And Baldwin's put in as well, power is another major issue in urban centers. Perfect, so we're all on the same page, so I'll keep going. So one of the questions that we had in the UCRC project was, how do we move from this status quo of resilience to pursue actual transformative resilience? This is a photograph of one of our researchers, Tree. He's from Cambodia. He now works with the Royal University of Phnom Penh, and his research was in Battambang, which is a city in the north of Cambodia. And he spent a lot of time researching with community members who relied on very marginal spaces for their housing and for their economic livelihoods. And so this is at one of the waste facilities. The group of people that he was working with there both work and live inside the garbage facility. So the UCRC project, just to give you a little bit more context, worked in Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. We chose cities that we call secondary cities. They're cities that are not necessarily capital cities, but cities that are really rapidly urbanizing. Because what we wanted to see was what would happen if we could intervene at a stage where urbanization was quickly taking off. Where were there opportunities to interrupt those traditional status quo patterns of urbanization and maybe make some changes for the better? And so the cities are mapped here: Lao Cai, Ninh Binh in Vietnam, Battambang and Koh Kong in Cambodia, Khon Kaen and Phuket in Thailand, and Bago and Dawei in Myanmar. And so I just wanted to put that on a map so that you could see it. So what we did was we tried to work with local communities to learn about how climate change was affecting their everyday lives. What were their everyday risks? Little mundane things that at a sort of urban scale we might not take into consideration. So most of the researchers in our partnership spent a lot of time in informal spaces in urban settings where policymakers, researchers, and even like policymakers on the most local scale, counselors and things, usually didn't spend any time trying to find out from those people what were the everyday risks they faced and how climate impacted them. I'm just going to read Baldwin's comment here. Social links back to particularly newer urban residents' place of origin. Yeah, exactly. So this is a great point Baldwin's pointing out. Who tends to live in spaces that look like this? Often they're not the people who are in positions of power within the city or who've been in the city for generations. Often people who live in marginalized spaces close to bodies of water, close to garbage processing facilities, or on lands that are not productive, are people who've been forced to move there because of some sort of migration need and have maybe been there for a generation or maybe a year or maybe a few months. And the social capital loss involved in migration, as everybody knows, is quite significant. And so understanding the dynamics of communities and how those dynamics either build resilience or enhance vulnerability was one of the key factors for a lot of our research. I have I'm going to go to that next, but I just happen to have a poster here because I'm in our office. This is one of the, I don't know if you can see any of the pictures, one of the student research posters that we had from Ningbing. There's I'm just going to flip to the next picture because then you can all see it. There's a new complex in Ningbing called Chang'an. Tourism, what's it called? It's a UNESCO World Heritage or Natural Heritage Site. And so here's a really great example of how the multi-scalar nature of what goes on in urbanization and in migration and in processes of the economy impact people on a very local scale. UNESCO granted this honorific title to Chang'an, which is a system of rivers with big, I think they call them karst-like mountains in between them. And so it's very picturesque and it's very beautiful. And they recognize the importance of this site, the natural importance of this site. And that created a knock-on effect of wanting to create a tourism complex in this area to bring more tourism to the area. Because of course, tourism brings dollars and dollars bring prosperity. And there was a public-private partnership developed between a tourism company who wanted to develop this complex and the local government in Ningbing. Well, the local, I think they call it like People's Committee in Ningbing. And of course, ecotourism, it was a great idea and brought all sorts of attention to the area, but it also brought really specific new environmental risks. And those risks fell much more heavily on women than they did on anyone else in the community. Before the UNESCO World Heritage Site became a thing, women and families in that area lived a normal sort of subsistence agriculture life. As that changed, a lot of the areas that were used for agriculture and aquaculture were taken over by the tourism complex, and as a livelihood for a lot of these women, a lot of these families. There was an offer to women in those families to work as boat drivers for tourists. Very gendered, very specific, and very precarious. And so I guess the assumption was that all of the families in Chang'an could forfeit their agricultural subsistence lifestyles in exchange for the earned income of women driving these boats, which is heavily reliant on global tourism. And so you can imagine what must be happening in Chang'an right now, for example, in a pandemic when there's no tourism. what we found in the research, what the researchers in that area found in the research, was that locals had little to no voice in the decision-making process of this public-private partnership. And the decisions that were made around what to do and how to resource things further marginalized already marginalized community members. Through the research that was done, the team was able to document how these environmental risks and livelihood risks impacted local families. And the researchers were able to convene a meeting with people from the tourism complex, as well as people from Ninh government, to discuss the impacts of these changes on local community members. We are still following up with this situation, and I, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, don't have an up-to-date update on how the situation is going, but that engagement still exists. Another way in which we sought to sort of promote transformative resilience was by influencing policy. So while a lot of our time was spent in communities like the ones I've been showing you, a lot of our time was also spent in rooms like this with policymakers. So in this picture, I think we have the former mayor of Bangkok and several members of United Nations delegations, several members of ASEAN and university faculty from around the world. I recognize a few from Southeast Asia and a couple from Japan in this photograph. And so what we did was work with policymakers to try and build their what we call receptive capacity. So their capacity to understand urban climate issues through a political ecology lens. So we sort of embedded the action research principle of change as a learning opportunity. And we focused on their daily practice again. So what is it the policymakers have to do every day? And where are the opportunities to influence them to build greater political will and change? So we facilitated researchers working closely with policymakers early in their research process so that they would know what kind of information policymakers needed, and also working with them iteratively throughout the production of new knowledge about climate vulnerabilities so that they could understand what kind of needs that the policymakers had, and also make the policymakers feel a little bit of ownership in the research as well. So our goal was to improve local governance by adapting policymakers' conceptual framing of urban climate resilience to one of a social justice issue, as opposed to the traditional natural hazards issue. And in that way, we were trying to create the types of knowledge that foster equitable and inclusive urban negotiation processes. We were trying to unpack the consequences of market-driven growth, and we were trying to begin to redefine resilience as the resilience of urban citizens, as opposed to the resilience of urban infrastructure. Just going to check the chat here. Oh, so Baldwin's saying that what's happening in Chang'an is similar to what's happening in African countries. And I think that the pattern of promoting one type of economic growth and assuming that it's going to trickle down and be beneficial to everybody in the community is quite common. And one of the things that our researchers were trying to do was to disrupt that assumption with evidence. And in Southeast Asia, what we noticed very clearly was a lack of evidence was a very particular problem. There was a big lack of research in that area. So in Khon Kaen, in Thailand, researchers worked very closely with policymakers to understand how residents were responding to urban flooding. So this is a city in Northeast Thailand that is very rapidly urbanizing, and it goes through regular flooding and drought cycles now because of climate change. And there was a very low-lying peri-urban municipality called Pralap, and they relied on fishing and agriculture there. It was very marginalized sort of land. And the flood risk in Pralab was built into the governance and planning processes of the city. It was known and it was habitual, And with the increase of impermeable surfaces, and the reliance on hard flood control measures like walls to protect the city center, water was being pushed out to communities like Pralab intentionally. And far from protecting the community of Pralab, as they further protected the city center, they put Pralab and its residents at increased risk. And what was also interesting, again, this multi-scalar nature of this issue, was that as communities upstream from Konkan also tried to divert water away from their city centers, that water flowed was the word I was going for, flowed through the water management system through channels and locks that were managed by a regional authority. So the city of Konkan actually had no control over when the floodgates would be opened at the regional level upstream and then flood possibly Konkan city center, and if not, all of Pralab. And one of the issues that was very apparent in this situation was that the lack of coordination and authority that Konkan was experiencing was quite mismatched with the level of responsibility that the municipality of Konkan had. So the municipality of Konkan had the responsibility to take care of residents in Pralab, but they didn't have the authority to control the floodgates, and they didn't have the resources to change the situation of Pralab. And the last thing that we sort of talk about doing in our project that was specific was using knowledge production activities to engage civil society. So we understood from the very beginning that in order to build political will and knowledge, we didn't just have to take from civil society and communities, we had to also give back to them and give them tools and information and power to use the knowledge that they already had and that they helped us to make to engage with policymakers on their own. So this is a still image from one of our researchers' films on the use of a technology called the AirBeam. And the AirBeam is a little device. You can see it in her hand there. It's that little black thing she's holding. And it can be hooked up to a cell phone, and it's used to measure air quality indicators. So it measures temperature, and it measures particulate matter 2.5. It measures, I think, smoke, it measures odor, it measures all sorts of things. And data can be uploaded directly from your device to a citizen science platform, and it can be charted and people can see it over time, and it's open source. And so if you have an AirBeam and someone else has an AirBeam and you're in the same place, you can compare your data over time or in different parts of the city, for example. And so they're really, really affordable. And our project bought a bunch of them and trained people on how to use them. And the researchers went out and used them as they wanted to use them. And what they all ended up doing was using them to engage civil society. So in Hanoi, in Vietnam, the AirBeams were used in elementary and high schools to allow school children and their teachers to learn about the technology of the device, but also to collect this information about urban air quality. There was one high school teacher that was so enthusiastic about this that he actually devoted an entire curriculum unit of his course to the measurement and comparison of air quality in different parts of the city at different times. And he also compared it with different cities. And he was using this as an opportunity to teach his students and people around in their community about pollution and climate change, but also about the role of civil society in fighting for environmental protection, for example. So this image is not the high school students. This is another event that they did, which was just an Earth Day celebration where they interviewed people and taught them to use the device and allowed them to measure a little bit. And they were often shocked at the level of contamination in what is quite a beautiful green city. And what we learned was that the value of environmental knowledge for motivating people to learn more about the environment or participate more in shaping the future of their communities has long been acknowledged. And we saw very clearly that citizen science of this type, using these really simple devices to just allow people to make knowledge and understand more the environment that they're in, was a really untapped space. People were very enthusiastic and very ready to participate in it, and very energized by it. And so this is something that we've been promoting quite strongly to other researchers. This is another image of the Airbeam, a different Airbeam team. This was in Myanmar, and the researchers formed a team of students, university undergraduate students, and they traveled around the country conducting, so it wasn't just the students would go into local communities all over Myanmar and teach them how to use the technology and conduct experiments with them. And, they kind of hooked people with this new cool technology, but it also raised their awareness of things like PM 2.5 and the dangers of air pollution. And it very carefully, given the context of Myanmar, also introduced this topic of rights and entitlements of urban citizens, in this case, to clean and healthy air. So it was a really exciting part of our project. We all really enjoyed the enthusiasm of it, but it was also something that was quite inspirational in that we could see that there's a whole area of education and research and activism that's quite untapped in certain parts of Southeast Asia. And certainly what we learned from the researchers there was previously civil society in Thailand, for example, had been the most significant driver of most change. And obviously with recent political changes, civil society has been significantly muted. I think there's really exciting potential for social issues that have much larger implications for people's well-being to be approached from this very daily risk situation that's presented by climate change and its sort of subsequent impacts like air pollution, flooding, food security, and things like that. So we're really excited about the opportunity to continue to promote the research that our team has been doing. And I'm really grateful that I got to come and chat with you about it today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We all just love the talk. We're all chatting and saying, oh my God, you just the style and the engagement and the breadth of what you covered. It's all been inspiring us. And I actually have a pile of questions for you.
Okay. I hopefully have a pile of answers.
Yeah, right. So I was reflecting, myself on your comment about how when people talk about infrastructure and resilience, they tend to talk about the physical infrastructure, not the people, right? The resilience of the people. And I think it's really striking because I was just reviewing a set of reports on climate adaptation by like C40 and McKinsey and other, the big players. And it was all about the physical infrastructure as if the people were not even there. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate your point of view. And then, so in that vein, Ravisha had the first question, which was, how can researchers be able to plan mitigation efforts given the high economic disparity among the urban population? So most of the disadvantaged urban dwellers don't have much of a voice in the mainstream conversations around climate resilience, but end up bearing the brunt of the change.
Yeah, that's the exact kind of question that keeps us up at night. And it's, I think, was the main driving force behind the UCRC project was that, I have to be careful how I say this. So many people make their livelihoods from climate change research and policy making and work in climate change. And so little is actually happening to benefit the people who are most at risk by climate change. And that is ethically difficult situation that we as scholars found ourselves in. And so the sort of ethos of the project was to think about things. So when we talk about climate change, we talk about mitigation, adaptation, transformation, these sorts of, concepts. Mitigating climate change is not the job of these people that we're seeing in our research, right? Because they're not really the ones producing the problems that cause climate change. And so mitigation was not as much our focus in this research as was transformation and not even so much adaptation, but resilience. And we know that without mitigation, we're done, right? And so this is why our research project tried to take a multi-pronged approach, working with community members, working with scholars, and working with the people who make decisions about things like mitigation, policymakers and industry. We often had sort of, close contacts with people who worked in industry. We were in special economic zones. We were in sort of the trade centers and things like that. And so I think what we found was scholars and researchers are really uniquely placed to be that bridge between community members who are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change and powerful people who make decisions that determine where the brunt of climate change is going to fall. And that sort of advocacy scholarship is what our researchers were engaged in. We often had our researchers taking policymakers, we call them boundary partners. We use the outcome mapping, IDRC's outcome mapping language of boundary partners. So if you're a researcher, who are the people whose behavior you're trying to change or impact or influence? And those are your boundary partners. And so often our most important boundary partners were policymakers. So our project would pay for our researchers to take their boundary partners to these communities, to spend time in the communities and learn directly from the communities. We would pay for these researchers to take their boundary partners to our events so that they could come and learn about political ecology and about the theoretical and conceptual, and sometimes the skill of, listening and learning and writing policy and adapting. So we would focus not just on the community members themselves, but how to get that knowledge usefully and productively into the hands of people with power.
Great answer. And I want to come back to this issue of advocacy scholarship in a minute. But let's take this question from Bogdan, who has his hand up, before we come back to it.
Oh, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the talk, Joanna, if I may. Yeah, it was super interesting to see the different, as you were just mentioning, different groups that are coming together to engage in these issues and simply to become more aware of what the issues are. So that's really interesting, and thank you again for the talk. My question, I was just wondering if you could go into some more details, if you have any examples on the policy making and the policymakers. How does it work? Do you have any examples? At what levels of policy do the different communities engage? Are we talking about lawmakers? Are we talking about elected politicians, like local representatives? So just if you have any indications on that, I'd be really interested.
Yeah, I can. So again, I want to preface this by saying I wasn't the one doing most of this research, and so I can't speak with great authority on it, but I am very intimately aware of all of the research, so I'll tell you about it. There were, for example, in Ninh, where we saw the boat industry, in that province, but not in the Chang'an complex, there was a community that they were sort of a marginalized community because I believe they were like a religious minority, and so they were sort of ostracized a little bit, and they were in what they called the Phu Hau commune, and the local government, the Ninh, so that's sort of provincial government level, and again, like Vietnam's governmental structure is very specific as a communist country, so their council in Ninh had approved the establishment of a special economic zone in and around this commune without the sort of consent of the commune themselves. And so that had happened and it was built. And by the time we got there, there was not much we could do about it existing. But we were engaging with the community to track contamination and sort of enhanced risks around water, specifically with flooding events and contamination. And what we were trying to do with them was document that in a very scientific and legitimate way, so that that could be used as evidence to have the local government sort of leverage the inspectors and the private organization that owned the special economic zone to actually enact the environmental protection things that they were, the practices that they had committed to and weren't doing. So there was that sort of level. We had in Battambang, where you saw Tree at the waste site, outside of the waste site, he was working with communities that had land along riverbeds and along train tracks that was informally settled by people. And the city had decided to revitalize those areas and turn them into like community gardens for the beautification and sort of gentrification of the city of Battambang. And as a result, all of those people had to be relocated, and they were being relocated to a place where there were already other people who had informally settled. And some of the people, interestingly in this case, had been formally settled in this informal area as former members of the military who were gifted land in exchange for their service. And then that had to compete with these informal people who were being rehoused. And so there was a really interesting study of sort of multi-generational tracks of power in the city of Battambang related to like military service, civil service, and just sort of agricultural forced migration, and how those power dynamics impacted where people were resettled or if they were actually able to take up that resettlement. And so in that case, Tree worked directly with people in the Battambang municipality to identify both how those power flows were impacting their decisions formally and legally and informally and tacitly. So there was a bit of both of it there. And I think one thing that always came out very clearly is the borders of these systems of power and governance are more fluid and pervious in these contexts than maybe we would assume they were in a North American context. And so there were always some sort of complicating factors there that our researchers were very careful about. We had some of our researchers arrested for congregating at a conference, and they were put in jail for several days. I mean, it's a difficult context in which to do work that criticizes systems that cause oppression. Trying to be careful.
Yeah, very well put. I was going to go to a question from Baldwin in the box. It's the chat. He says, it seems that in a number of areas, newer arrivals lack agency and legitimacy in their new environments, especially in societies that may not have as much freedom of movement. Are we seeing this here as well?
I've got a really good example of that. We had a great researcher who was a student at York University, and his research was in Hanoi. And so in Vietnam, because of the communist system, and my research is in Cuba, so this is all very familiar to me, you are registered in a place, and that is where you live, and that is where you have access to services, and that's where you have rights. And your mobility is not fluid in the way that it is in Canada, for example. And so they had ethnic minority groups from the region of Lao Cai, which was one of our secondary cities, who, because of a lack of livelihood opportunities, would migrate to Hanoi, to the city. That migration was technically illegal, and that meant that their housing and access to any services at all was also informal and illegal. So when those, and I think actually I have a photograph I think it was in the last photograph here of the, nope, sorry. The last photograph here is of some of those migrants in Hanoi. This is one of Jonathan's photos, I think. Or it might just be one that he pulled off the internet. But what his research was looking at was how when these people were living in illegal, informal housing and their water got cut off, they had no recourse because they had to deal with essentially a slumlord who was untouchable to them because they didn't have the right to be there. When they needed healthcare, they had to amass enough money to return to Lao Cai to seek healthcare, which obviously in emergent situations is not an option. Their children often could not travel with them, migrate with them, because they had to be in school in Lao Cai. So you can see sort of the complexity of, especially in this very rigid situation, how that happens. And that's within one country. And then if you want to talk about Myanmar migrants moving to Bangkok, and this was, a big issue at the beginning of the pandemic, because the informality of livelihoods and of housing made those people more prone to getting COVID more quickly, which made them the focal point and the scapegoat for the whole COVID crisis in Bangkok. The rules around mobility for Myanmar migrants who move to Thailand are regional. So if you get permission, which most of them don't, you're only allowed to move around in one province of Thailand, which means that you're sort of tied to a specific industry. Most of them have no permission whatsoever, which means that they're illegal and they have no legal rights whatsoever. And so I think the issue of climate migration is very much a driver of a lack of entitlements and rights, and causes a lot of insecurity.
Thank you. I want to now turn to a couple questions on ecotourism, since we're in Thailand right now. And so I actually taught at ecotourism studio in Thailand, in Krabi, about 15 years ago. So I know the situation a bit. And one of your comments kind of stuck out to me. You said that that some of the opportunities were very gendered, and I guess so. When we went there and we talked to the locals, we did see that, but we also saw that the previous economy was very gendered in agriculture as well. So we ended up kind of weighing in on thinking that ecotourism was a pretty good thing for the population. Because so I'm wondering if you can talk about what might be the opportunities in ecotourism.
Yeah, so the case of ecotourism that we were most focused on was this one in Chang'an. And I think in Chang'an, we're talking about people who've lived for generations in that area and whose livelihoods were based on, and I mean, the physical space is very particular, right? There's not, like, as soon as you get out of the complex, those spaces don't exist anymore. And so the people relied on the very spaces that were turned into ecotourism spaces. And it was kind of a zero-sum game. It was either ecotourism or it was agriculture. And the people who relied on the agriculture were not part of the decision-making process of whether or not it was going to now become tourism. What happened, and I'm not clear on the details of the women's union in Chang'an, if it existed before the tourism complex or if it was formed afterwards. Our researchers worked very closely with this women's union. They were sort of the main stakeholder group that they worked with. And what they were identifying was that because the whole family's livelihood was taken, but the job opportunity that was offered was gendered, the switch between agriculture, which, as much as the division of labor there was going to be gendered, was a sort of whole family activity, to you get to drive a boat once a week and earn tips if people come to Chang'an. That sort of activity, that sort of change put them in a very specifically difficult position. And then the environmental risks associated with contamination. They built roads in, people are eating there, there's garbage disposal, there's, everything that comes with tourism. And then the climate hazards of like, you can't take tourists in a boat during a monsoon, or if there are no tourists during a pandemic. Those sort of vulnerabilities were very specific to women's contributions to the household. In terms of opportunities, I think one of the things that we saw was them talking about expanding into things like food provision and basically other service sectors around tourism, which I think we felt wasn't necessarily much different than the boat driving.
Right, got it. That makes sense. Our other question on tourism, which came from Ravisha, is about the question about the other side, the tourists themselves. So here you have tourism that creates incredible amount of waste. Even ecotourism still has some, some problems and, deep environmental problems. So how do we educate the tourists? How do we make the tourist part of this whole resilience picture rather than kind of putting the resilience onus on the, on the residents?
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect to consider. And I'll say we didn't do research on that specifically, but one place that we did have a lot of conversation was that, so we built a theory of change for this whole project. And in the theory of change, we identified, the different boundary partners that we wanted to influence. And one distant boundary partner was sort of consumers. So tourists and people who were buying things made in special economic zones and things like that. It wasn't in the purview of this research to spend a lot of time paying attention to that, but awareness raising so that people who were consumers of tourism or services or products made in those areas had some sort of conscious and awareness of what was happening, because most of us don't, was a big part of our overall focus. It wasn't what the researchers were doing. So we actually made a series of 5 short films that explore our research and sort of explain what we were trying to do. And those films have been used in public events by us, by a lot of our partners. I know they're used in a lot of classrooms. We've promoted them sort of through social media. And what we were trying to do there, without too much added cost and labor to our already very taxed researchers, was make the knowledge and evidence that we were developing publicly consumable and easily available to people who were, as consumers, wanting to have a bit more of a conscience in how their choices, purchases or services or travel impacted people's lives. So that's as far as we were able to get with that. There were conversations about the importance of campaigns around, working conditions in some of the special economic zones and things like that, but they fell a little bit outside of our scope at that time.
Thank you. We're going to have to conclude, and I want to make sure that we know how to get in touch with you. And is the Southeast Asia Partnership Network ongoing? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
So www.ucrc.ca is our website. It was a 5-year project funded by SSHRC and the IDRC, and that funding has terminated. But our principal investigator, Amrita Danier, who was dean at the UTM and is here at our planning faculty, has been keeping us going. And I'm still here, basically working with most of the researchers. And we're actually applying to a School of Cities grant on the 7th to see if we can continue some of our work. One of my colleagues, Rebecca McMillan, and I are both fellows of the School of Cities, and the grants that we received, the work that we did was contributing to this project as well. So we're still going, and we'd love to be in contact with anyone who's interested. I'll put my email is on the front slide there, so people can feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.